Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. It's very good to be joining you here. It would be nice to be together in Washington or Montreal, Boston, or Kuala Lumpur for a couple of weeks working together. But thanks to the wonders of this Zoom world we are living in today, at least we can get together for an hour or so. And I'm happy to be able to share some of my ideas, which are a little bit of synthesis of a 2-week workshop in an hour, but also most of you will have received a copy of an article that I just put out earlier this week. So it's straight off the e-presses. And so we're going to play around with some things. We're going to experiment with some things. I'm a great believer, as many of you who've attended my workshops, I like trying new things. That means some things work and some things don't. And that's part of the challenge, I think, of being a leader in the 2020s, in actual fact, is being willing to understand that being creative, being innovative means that everything won't necessarily work. But we'll do our best to, with Jonathan's help and Larby and Jean-Michel's, to make it as informative and fun as we possibly can, given the size of the topic and this barrier or this facilitation technology that we have called Zoom that I think we're all using a lot these days. So there will be, as Jonathan mentioned, there will be polls. There will be time for some self-reflection, so it would be good if you had a pen and paper close at hand. And there'll also be some time for some brief exchanges, Q&As, however they happen, maybe during, at the end. Hopefully I can keep your attention, keep it as interactive and keep it as interesting as possible, so you'll be able to learn something about these. Really what we're talking about today are the 3 levels of consciousness required for a leader in 2020. So I'm going to show you a few slides, and hopefully you can all see this, and you can still see me up in the corner there. So we're talking about strategic leadership in the 2020s. Strategic in the sense that as we rise up through our organizations, we take on more strategic decisions, which really means positions, and that means we have to take more strategic decisions, which a quick definition of a strategic decision is where often on a longer time scale than most other decisions we take on a daily basis, and they are the ones that are really, really important that we get them right. So what I'm trying to do over the course of the next hour or so is introduce you to various new ways of being, new ways of seeing things that will hopefully help you take better decisions when you go back to your office or into your home office through the Zoom world once at the end of the seminar. So in the description, it mentioned the VUCA world that we're all living in. And any of you, again, who've attended my workshops, this is always a way I start in terms of trying to represent how the world is looking at any time as we move forward from one day to another. And there's basically 6 forces that you can see identified on that screen, which is shaping this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world in which we are living. So very quickly, I'm going to show you, I've put together a little slide here to show you a few of those forces that are really shaping the world that you are having to leading today, wherever you are in the world, Mozambique, Kenya, Tanzania, Montreal, it's the same world we're living in. So a few examples around technology. Obviously, we're using Zoom, and even Zoom was taken by surprise at how the growth and demand for its technology has soared over the past 8 weeks or so. Obviously, direct delivery from shops to homes, whether it's Amazon, drones, or somebody on a bicycle, or hand delivery, is becoming the norm. And of course, we're all worried about technology gathering our data and governments doing it, and Google and Amazon collecting our data. So those technological drivers are shaping this VUCA world. Obviously, some of you in Nigeria the oil price is having a huge effect on life, just as it is in Canada. There's many business bankruptcies, and obviously nobody really knows whether we're going into recession, a slowdown, or will there be what Mr. Trump would like to see, a huge bounce back in the stock market and the economy. Government, around the political and legal, government surveillance around that technology, people are worried about it. Obviously, governments all around the world are incurring huge amounts of debt here to support their economies during this time. And of course, travel restrictions, which most of society would not have accepted 2-3 months ago, have now become the norm, and people are looking for that kind of protection. Sociodemographically, again, a lot of us interact with our colleagues, friends, and clients around the world through Zoom. Some of us are feeling isolation. Many of us have been confined. And at the same time, prisoners are being released from confinement, right? Because of the risk of catching COVID-19 in an institutional setting. And now it's very difficult to buy things other than you're buying online. So there is a move sociodemographically of less consumerism, and there's a real worry in the business world about whether that is going to return. In business, there's many sectors on life support. How will they return? What will they look like when they do return in restaurants, in hotels, airlines, even hair salons, and obviously long-term care facilities here in the West, where they're really suffering with high rates of COVID-19. Business to consumer is becoming the norm. Companies are going direct through technology and home delivery. And we've got social distancing, business distancing, which is really challenging how businesses are able to run and be successful now and when it comes out of this downturn. And around the environment, many of our cities, they're almost pleasurable to drive around, given that traffic flow is much easier. We have cleaner air, cleaner water, and those climate targets that seemed unreachable 3 months ago, all of a sudden people have realized that yes, we can shut down entire industries and there is an effect on the climate. So what's going to happen when we start coming out of this? So I've just put 3 bullets on each of those 6 points, but you can see we're coming into a very complex VUCA world. And the reality is that is the new normal. And people are talking about we're not going to go back to the old normal. It will be some kind of new normal. And we're not really sure what that looks like. And it's impossible to know what that looks like. And believe it or not, that is just for today. If we were to do this exercise tomorrow, maybe some of these factors would have changed. So this new normal is going to be changing on a weekly, daily, monthly. And people are talking it could be 1-2 years before we get back to any resemblance of the old normal, if that ever comes to pass. So in this changing world, how do we lead? How does this change the challenge that we face as leaders when we're working with teams remotely and really being challenged by a radical change within 2 months of the demands that are being put on us by our organizations, our communities, and even our families? How do we have to be different? Believe it or not, this slide, which I've shown many times around the world, I think over the last 10 years, still remains very valid. You know, how does a leader lead? Really, the challenge is always getting groups of people together and asking the questions that matter. What are those big questions that our societies, our governments, our organizations, our families, tribes, and communities need to ask? And Peter Drucker said many, many years ago, the leaders of tomorrow are those who will be able to ask the right questions. So what are those questions we really need to discuss? And how can we have learning conversations with diverse stakeholders who see the world very differently from us? And how can we come up with something new? Everybody talks about learning organizations, but to have a learning organization, we need to have learning conversations and capture that knowledge that comes out. How do we recognize and come up with something new with these people and capture it and turn it into decisions? The reasons we ask those questions is ultimately we need to have a decision. And many of us spend much of our time in meeting after meeting after meeting discussing, and we rarely get to that decision point. What are we going to do? And hence, ultimately, if we don't take any action from it, what was the point? Why did we go through all this time, energy in terms of challenging ourselves, challenging our teams, if we don't actually do whatever comes up in terms of the action item? And this is why you earn your money. This is why what you're paid for is to basically do this in different 1-hour meetings, 2-hour meetings, lunch meetings, cabinet meetings, whatever it happens to be. How do we make that happen? The reality is there are 4 levels of conversation. And in a second, we'll do a poll on this. But the 4 levels, let me explain them, and then we can do our little exercise. The first one is where basically everybody talks nice. We're very polite. We stick to what we call the party line in politics, and we're basically trying to keep the peace. If we do disagree, if we do have a conflicting different point of view, POV's point of view, to other people, we're going to keep it to ourselves rather than express it, because the culture of the team, the culture of the meeting, the culture of the organization encourages not to challenge people. Level 2 is very different. Level 2 is where I talk tough. I talk as though I'm right. I hold the truth, and if you disagree with me, you're wrong. And hence, this is when a lot of speaking, and again, this happens in meetings. People speak over each other, they insist they're right, but there's little listening going on. I'm just conversing to hold my position, defend my position, and if you go against me, you're literally going against me. You're not going against my opinion, you're going against me. Level 3 is where conversations start getting interesting. Now, if I'm sitting down with a tribes person, or I'm from finance and somebody comes from a different department or function, I try and understand where they're coming from. I appreciate where they're coming from. And if they have a different point of view, I'm actually open to change and understanding things from a much more holistic, self-reflective point of view. And finally, level 4. Generative flow, something new is emerging. And this is where a team or you as a leader is really aware of what's happening in a conversation, what's happening in a meeting, and you're really trying to sense, identify what's coming up in this conversation that did not exist before the conversation began. And this is a very challenging step for a leader to get into, not defend their position, not trying to keep things quiet, but literally to sense what's new, what's coming out, what is this new intellectual capital, new knowledge that we're generating. So having explained those 4 levels of conversation, I'm going to ask Jonathan to post poll number 1, which basically asks you to vote. In general, obviously, what level of conversation occurs in the meetings you attend in your organization? So please go ahead and vote. Okay, interesting. So I think you can all view the results there. And as you can see, what in general, what we are aiming for is to have either level 3 or level 4 conversations. Obviously, level 4, in certain situations where we're trying to come up with new things, we've almost got to get to level 4. And it's interesting to see that level 4 got the least number of votes in terms of percentage, 14%. But it's also encouraging a sense that 14% of us are running or leading meetings, participating meetings when new things are emerging. I guess if you put level 1 and level 2 together, you've got 47%. We've got almost half of us, half of our organizations, where really we're not having very productive meetings where we're coming up with new ideas and appreciating other points of view. And today, in terms of our leadership, that's a huge challenge. Our organizations have to take big decisions, address the big questions, and we need to have at least level 3 and preferably level 4 conversations. So you can argue level 1, level 2 is roughly 50%, level 3, level 4 obviously 50% as well. And so the challenge for each of us as a leader, whether you're the host of a leader, chairing a meeting, calling a meeting, or just participating in a meeting, how are you going to have to be different in order to take up the level of conversations that you're having in your organizations or with your teams to literally to the next level? If you're at level 2 now, how can you get to level 3? If you're at level 3, how can you get to level 4? And so it's really going to fall on each of us as individuals to take on that challenge if we want to play a leadership role. So we'll move on a little bit if I can. So questions that matter. If you remember, I said the leaders of tomorrow are those who will be able to ask the right questions. We want to have level 3, level 4 conversations around the big important questions that our organization is facing. So what I'd like you to do is, many of you know the expression elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is kind of the thing that we all know is there in a meeting. It's very present, but nobody talks about it. Nobody dare talk about it. It's almost become a taboo. Yet we know it's really fundamental and a question that we really need to address. So what I'd like you to do is write down. You're not going to have to share this with anyone. What I'd like you to do is just write down for yourself, and I'm going to give you a minute in silence. Just write down, what do you think are the 3 big questions that your organization really needs to address? Just take the time. What are the questions that matter in your organization? Don't be shy, write them down, capture them. In any organization, there are questions we know need to be discussed that we just can't find a way to do it. So what would they be in your organization? Give you 15 seconds more. If you want to be a leader, then what that quote says, the leaders of tomorrow are those who will be able to ask the right questions. So if you want to play a leadership role in your organization, what are those right questions? Okay, so for the rest of the session, I'm really going to give you 3 different, I guess, levels of consciousness, levels of awareness, things to consider as you try and address those 3 questions in your meetings. And we're going to, as I say, do some more polls, experiment with things, and hopefully by the end you'll have not only the questions, but also maybe a few avenues to explore as to how to get those questions onto the table in your organizations. So this next slide, hopefully you can see that. I'm not sure it's burning as brightly as it should be, but this is an image of a campfire basically. And most of us, whether we're in Africa, whether we're in North America or Europe, most of us at some time have tried to light a fire. And this is kind of the metaphor of lighting a team or building a team. And when you do try and start a fire, if you've ever tried to start a fire with just one piece of wood, it's a real challenge. If you have two pieces of wood, then it's much easier. It's dramatically easier. But one piece of wood to make a fire is difficult. And it's the idea of leadership. If there's no followers, if there's no second or third person, then it's very tough to be a leader when you're just on your own. And the idea of if you have 10 pieces of wood to make the fire, and there's one or two which are damp, rotten, then again, if you have team members that you could describe similarly, then again, it's very difficult to have conversations, level 3, level 4 conversations with those people in the room, unless you somehow can be very different. And sometimes that means getting rid of them. And also, there's the idea of if it was pouring torrential rain at the moment, this fire would quickly be put out. So those macro, that big picture conditions, it's very tough to light a fire when those macro conditions are not correct. So this is a bit of a metaphor for leadership and for what we're going to be talking about over the next half an hour or so, because what we're really trying to do is keep that fire burning and in a healthy way, sustainable way. And in terms of conversations, there's really 3 ways that we need to be aware, not just in terms of sticks and something to light the fire and whether it's raining or not. In meetings and answering those questions, it's about yourself, your physical body. It's about being aware of the social body, the atmosphere, the culture, the climate of your organization and your meeting you're holding. And also the big picture, how aware of you of what's going on around the world with different stakeholders outside of your current organization. So you have yourself, you have your team, and you have the big picture thinking. And we're going to look at this big picture thinking first, because that's often where we start. And I know some people work for government, some people work for corporations. So I'm going to show you examples of both. And again, we'll do a couple of exercises on it. But in terms of corporations, prior to year 2000, the old way of being a corporate leader, it was relatively simple. What you tried to do was maximize your consumer satisfaction. And if you had consumers who were satisfied with your product or service, they would pay money. And that would mean if your consumers were happy and your shareholders were happy, then you were probably doing a good job. And they were buying your goods and services. G&S stands for goods and services. And maybe if you had a little bit of control about your raw materials and concern about your suppliers, that was the limit of your level of consciousness that you needed to have. You have good consumers, customers, you have shareholders are happy, you're doing a good job, you're likely to get a promotion. This world looks very different when we look at 2020. Now it's a very different world and represents very different challenges for corporate leaders. And I mean, I could go into this. This is a complex system, which again, it's VUCA, right? It's very volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And these things are always changing. But just to illustrate, now we don't have to just have consumer satisfaction. We need to be thinking about the well-being, the overall well-being of our consumer. We also need to be thinking about the communities in which we operate and work, our factories, etc. We need to be part of that community. We also need total stakeholder satisfaction. It's not good enough just to have shareholder satisfaction. We need every stakeholder to be satisfied with what we're doing. We also need to be looking at our entire supply chain throughout the world, and often we are held responsible by our consumers for what's going on in the entire supply chain. We have to be conscious of the environment and whether we're polluting the water with our factory. We have to be responsible for how we will dispose of our computers or cars or car batteries or car tires, etc. And in actual fact, what happens is, as a good corporate leader, we basically have to be responsible and aware of all of this when we are taking decisions. So what the challenge of leadership in a corporation in prior to the year 2000 versus what it is today is much more demanding. It's much more challenging to understand what is going on in this very complex VUCA world. But if you want to be successful, you have to do it. Now let's come to government. Many of you work in government ministries, departments, etc. And again, if you've attended my seminars, you'll know that I've been very interested in the concept of gross national happiness. I visited Bhutan, and the idea of gross national happiness is something that kind of challenges the idea of how governments have traditionally measured their development, which has often been through economics. And we talk in gross national happiness of having different pillars of gross national happiness. And often, an example of Bhutan, they have 4 or 5 different pillars that they consider to be just as important as economic growth, the GDP. Even here in Quebec, where we live in Montreal, where SETYM is based, we live in a society that at least has 2 different pillars. We have economics, which is obviously very important, but we also have the language. The French language here in Quebec is considered very important. And we as a society are willing to pay an economic price in order to protect the use of the French language in this province. It's been decided over the years by us as a society, as a people, that this is okay, this is acceptable, this is who we are. So the challenge for every community, every province, every state, every country is to identify what are the 4, 5, 6 different pillars of gross national happiness. And in actual fact, there's a whole list of potential pillars we could use depending on the situation we face. Levels of corruption, protection of our culture, defense, safety of our citizens, the military, etc. Obviously economics, education of our youth, our children, the environment. Are we willing to pay a price? Are we willing to stop mining companies or forestry companies coming into our country if they are going to harm our environment? We will pay an economic price, but maybe to protect the environment, that's a price worth paying for who we are as a people, as a society. Good governance, parliamentary systems, democracy, etc., traditional forms of government, the health of our citizens, valuing the informal traditional sectors, our role regionally as a country or internationally, the health of our justice system or the independence of our justice system, freedom of the press, media, eliminating privilege and discrimination, public safety, tribalism, getting rid of tribalism, all these kind of things can be pillars of gross national happiness. So what we'd like you to do is our next poll is there's a list of 10 different pillars there. And what we would like you to do is identify 4. Which do you think, if you had the choice, which 4 would you choose? So just choose any 4 and then click on those 4. Okay, so I think you can all see the results of the polling now. Those of you who are familiar with Bhutan and that example of gross national happiness will recognize that education, which came out top, is certainly a pillar in Bhutan. Good governance. I think this is the ultimate example that I would often use, example of leadership. The concept of gross national happiness was developed by the king of Bhutan. And as unfortunately we are well aware, in different parts of the world, some kings have a lot of power, others have kind of symbolic power. But the king of Bhutan recognized that if good governance really was a pillar of gross national happiness, then having one person as a king with basically ultimate power was not a form of good governance. So he took the radical decision of saying we are going to introduce democracy. And I was in Bhutan at the time this was happening, and everybody I spoke to about this wanted the king to stay. They did not want democracy. They wanted the king to remain. And it was interesting that he pushed and pushed and pushed and basically resigned as king, became a symbolic king, and they introduced the system of parliamentary democracy because the king recognized that he might be a good person with the well-being of his citizens at heart, but maybe future members of his family might not be like that. And hence, for good governance, they needed to introduce democracy with all its strengths and weaknesses, etc. Justice, I can see, has got a high level of marks as well. What else can we note? Actually, what's the low ends? International regional leadership, press media freedom, culture, protection of culture. Interestingly enough, in Bhutan, became one of the pillars. Protecting their Buddhist culture was really important to them as a people. Now, just imagine if you sat down as a leader in your community, in your organization, in your government, and started having discussions, level 3, level 4 level conversations with people around what should be the pillars of gross national happiness for our community. That would be asking a key question, a question that matters for the future of your society. And then the challenge would be, how would you go about getting all these diverse voices into this conversation and as a movement in order to come to some sort of consensus about what are the 4 or 5 things that are really fundamental about how we are. So it's an example of leadership. It's really this high level of consciousness. Whether you're a corporate leader, whether you're a global government leader, we have to be aware of these different things and factor them into our decision making if we want to play a leadership role in our organizations. So let's move on a little bit further, and let's move on to the second. Well, it's actually the first point, but the second level of consciousness is ourself, our physical bodies. And many of us will recognize that we have brains, we have hearts, and we have our stomachs, our gut. And in actual fact, in English, we use the expression, our gut feeling. What is our gut telling us? What is our heart telling us? And again, when we deal with getting buy-in to the decisions, then obviously buy-in, what we're looking for is an emotion. We're trying to get that buy into a decision so action happens. So we do have our brains, but imagine when you're mentally stressed, how do you feel emotionally? How available are you for others when you go home after a long day, you've had a tough meetings all day, and you go home, how available are you for your wife, husband, for your children? Same thing, if you've had an argument with your wife the previous night, or with your husband, or even with your boss, and you go into a 9 o'clock meeting, you're not the same. You're very different. And recognizing that and taking that into account and maybe doing something about it before going into the meeting is also a good leadership level of presence, consciousness, mindfulness that we can adopt. And also, how do you feel when decisions are being taken? And some of us have to sit in meetings where decisions are being taken that we just don't feel are right. In our guts, something our body is telling us, something that really isn't right. So, and if you have a backache or just a headache, or even if you're hungry, it's very tough to pay attention in a meeting when all you're thinking about is lunch. So, and in a fight or flight situation, if the alarm goes off or a fire breaks out, which do you hear first? It tends to be your gut that you respond to first. And it's something that we can either listen to or not. We can be aware of or not. We can be aware of the emotions, our own emotions. How do we feel about something? Or we can rely on our head. So this is something that comes from improvisation exercise, but the challenge of being present in a meeting, even on this meeting, I've been talking for half an hour now. People are starting to get distracted. They've got their devices that are ringing. They've got other things that they want to be thinking about. Maybe you are getting hungry or thirsty. But the reality is, if you are not fully present in a meeting, listening and able to respond to people with both your heart, brain, and gut, then you're never going to get to those level 3, level 4 conversations. And the challenge, the good thing in a sense, is our mind can be all over the place, but our body cannot be in 2 places at the same time. So a little experiment for you here. I'd like to think of a problem in your life today where you're feeling stuck, where you don't really know what to do. It could be a work problem. It could be a personal problem. Just think of an example. And I'm going to wait a few seconds. And we're going to do a little exercise here. I know you've been sitting down, listening to me for a while. But think about this problem. Which problem is it where you feel that you're feeling a little stuck? You don't know what to do. Come up with one example, a big one or a small one. So, we're going to use our bodies a little bit because we've all, as I say, we've all been sitting down. We've all got a problem in our mind. So, how can we maybe use our bodies to look at that differently? So, what I'd like you to do is everybody stand up, and that includes Jean-Michel, Larby, Jonathan, if you're there. Stand up. And there's a move that I learned many years ago, and it's called Shake the Tree. And we've done it in some of our workshops around the world at various times. And when you shake the tree, you just stand like this and shake. So irrespective of who is watching you, even if you're in a glass building and there's windows across, just start moving around, jumping around, move your legs, move your feet. If I can do it with 60 people watching me, then you can do it with nobody watching you. There's Jonathan, there's Jonathan, thank you there. So just move around, let it all hang out for 30 seconds. And now stop and think about that problem again. How do you see it differently? How do you feel about it differently? Is your gut telling you something different about it? Is your head telling you something? Can you see it differently? Maybe you can post your things in the chat, whether you think it changed. But for many people, moving around when you are stuck gives you a lightness, gives you a different perspective, and it can really help in terms of integrating all this into decision making. If I return to my slides again, oops. So maybe you're not feeling quite as stuck as you were 30 seconds ago. And that's why we go for a walk, right? That's why it's always, we go for a coffee, just to have a break, just to think about it differently. So being very consciously aware of our bodies can really have a powerful effect on our decision making. And if we do, let me get to poll 2. If I put up, Jonathan, can you put that up? Great. So in your organization, which is appreciated the most? Emotions, analysis of data, or going with your gut? So is it intellectual intelligence that's valued? Is it emotional intelligence that's happened? Or is it people that has that gut, that feeling, just really instinctively intuition is valued over everything else? Okay, I think so rational, intellectual thought, people's intelligence, that pure brain power for almost 2/3 of us is valued the most. Emotional intelligence, people do recognize the value of somebody who can appreciate and express emotions, capture them, and are really aware of them. And again, as a leader, ignoring emotions is a very dangerous thing to do. You might take a brilliant decision intellectually, but if you don't have that emotional buying of people, your decision is not going to turn into action. And funnily enough, going with the gut, we only get 80%, 8%, not 80%. But just think about a few situations. As a corporate leader, the answer as to whether you should stop polluting the local water or the emissions coming out of the stacks of polluting the air, the answer is not found on an Excel spreadsheet. Do you provide adequate safety protection for your employees? Do you give them safety gear, even for COVID-19? Do you accept a brown or white envelope? There is no Excel spreadsheet or MS Project template that is going to tell you what you should do, right? It is something about who you are. It is often your gut, what feels right, what you can live with, morals, ethics, etc. It's not an intellectual decision. And it's the same thing in government. Should you prioritize the hiring of people from your own tribe, from your own village, or from your clique? Should you consult all stakeholders, those who you know disagree with you? And should you accept a brown or white envelope? Again, it's not an intellectual decision. It's valued in our organizations. It's valued in our universities. That's how most of our education is built. But the reality is good corporate leaders, good government leaders, community leaders, we need something else, right, as well. That intuition, that emotional connection, it's really important. And we recognize it when we're in these kind of decision-making situations. And finally, the answer is inside of you. It's the leader you are. If you listen to those, you don't ignore your brain. It's a really useful source of information. But if you're only using this and not these, you're going to be struggling to challenge, really ask those questions and take those strategic decisions that cannot be processed through an Excel spreadsheet. And you need to be present, fully present, listening to hear what your body, what your intuition, what your gut is saying to you. So now we're going to talk, lastly, it's our last section, the social field, the social bodies, the meeting rooms, the virtual meeting room that we're in now at this moment. We're in a meeting with 66 people at the moment. And going back to that metaphor of a fire, I really like this poem by Judy Brown. It says, what makes a fire burn is the space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs packed in too tight, can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between as much to the wood. And when we're able to build open spaces in the same way we have learnt to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel, an absence of the fuel together, that makes fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. So it's all about the space the wood is in, how it's combined together. And it's the same thing with us in a meeting. If there were 66, 67 of us in a physical space now, the meeting would be very different than it is when we're on an online version. But each of us can make an impact. Obviously, in a webinar setting, it's me doing 99% of the talking. And that's a little photograph of me. But the reality is we're all in a network here. And I'm only talking as I am because you are there. I wouldn't be doing this if you weren't. So the idea of if I'm not paying attention to my own gut, my heart, and my brain, this is what each of these people can bring to any meeting you hold. You can only work on yourself. And if you were not there, the meeting would be very different, right? If somebody leaves a meeting that you're in a physical meeting and somebody leaves, or somebody comes in, everything changes. So that what we talk about social fields is how do you manage that energy in that room so that when you bring up those big elephant in the room questions with stakeholders who are very diverse, how are you going to behave differently to make what needs to happen in that space, whether it's a virtual Zoom meeting or whether it's a face-to-face meeting. So the social field is described as the dynamic energy of life space that interacts with human consciousness. That the space energy literally does affect how we are, what we are aware of, what we're going to do and say. Just imagine you and your friend are walking down a street and you decide to go into a church or a mosque. What happens? Right? You were walking down, chatting quite animatedly, maybe cracking jokes. What happens when you go into a church or the mosque? It's tough to describe, but there is a very definite change that happens. Right? It's very different. Same thing, if you're used to working with people in an office setting, and all of a sudden you walk into a party, a social environment, and you meet that same person there who you chat quite comfortably with at work, all of a sudden in a social situation or in a restaurant with their family, something's different. You're going to have a different conversation. And in the West, we spend a lot of time going out for breakfast meetings and lunch meetings with people, very specifically, because the conversation we will have with somebody over lunch is very different to what we would have with that same person sitting in a boardroom at 10 o'clock. And finally, you just imagine you or your wife and husband are in the kitchen having a serious conversation about COVID-19. And your 6-year-old daughter walks in. It's going to change. The dynamic's going to change. What you say, how you say, your physical language, everything is going to change based on the fact somebody's walked in. So how aware are we of managing this social field? Because we will never have those level 3, level 4 conversations unless we take on the challenge of recognizing what's going on and then trying to create the space we need for those conversations to take place. And that's the challenge of every leader and each one of us on this meeting. To have those conversations around the questions that matters in our organization. It's our job to create the social field where it can happen. So we can each affect the social field affects us all the time. It affects what's allowed, what's encouraged, what can be said, what cannot be said, and ultimately the results we will get. And ultimately it's the social field that allows you to do things which as we're talking about today, is how do we discuss those three big questions that you came up with at the beginning of the webinar? So, it is the social field that determines whether you will have level 1 or level 4 conversations in any meetings you run. And it's really you that will decide. It's your job as a leader to change that social field. So we're now going to run poll number 4. It's a very simple one. What behavior does the typical social field encourage you to adopt in most of the meetings you attend in your office, at your workplace? Does it encourage you to challenge the status quo, or does it encourage you to not challenge the status quo? Okay. So we have 44% where feel we are encouraged to challenge the status quo. And we have 56% where we're not encouraged to challenge the status quo. Obviously, if we are going to have those level 3, level 4 conversations, then we need, and when I'm talking about each and every one of us on this call, our job is to somehow go back and accept the challenge of creating social fields in our meetings, in our virtual meetings, where we can challenge the status quo. People can say genuinely how they feel about anything, whether you are the boss or not, and really have those kind of conversations that we need to have about those important questions that we've identified. Just imagine if we were sitting around a campfire or sitting around an e-campfire. I'm not sure, again, this is a video, not just a photograph, but just imagine, again, one day, hopefully, we will be in Kuala Lumpur again and having 2 weeks to have these types of conversations. Your challenge back in your organizations is, whether you can get together physically or not, is literally to create that space so that fire can burn brightly, discussing the questions that you really need to address in your organizations. And as a leader, it's your job to go back there and do it. And so strategic leadership, to summarize, in the 2020s, it's shaping the social field in our organizations, in our communities, so we can hold those level 3, level 4 conversations about the critical questions that have not been discussable to date. That's the challenge we face. And because the elephant does not want to be invisible anymore, we've got to put it out there and assume the challenge, responsibility of making it happen. And how do we do that? Is by being fully present and listening to all the information coming from our entire bodies. It's to be aware of that social energy, that social field, and shaping in and influencing it so those conversations can happen. And it's making sure that we have a real awareness of what's going on globally, how everything's interconnected, and really see that big picture world view in which those decisions will have to be taken and implemented. So how would you have to be different in order to enable and create those social fields so you can go back? There's only you can decide that, and there's only you who can make that happen. So next steps, please read the article. I will send you another copy of it again. Become aware of those 3 levels. How can you be more present? Start experimenting with the social field and how you can influence it. And start taking into account that VUCA, corporate or gross national happiness big picture. And of course, sign up for those workshops at SETYM. They will be offered one day, we just don't know when, and it will be a pleasure to have you there or see you there again. So I think now, if there are any final questions, we're just on the hour mark, but we might have a few questions, if possible, from Jean-Michel or anybody who'd like to pose them.
Yes, well, first, thank you very much, Mark, for sharing your thoughts. That was very instructive. So good morning, everyone, or shall I say good afternoon to all of you joining us from West Africa, from Central Africa, East Africa, as well as Asia. We had people from Bangladesh for sure. We saw some people from Georgia, Rafiki Yangos from Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Benin, just all over the world. So first on a personal angle, Mark, thanks for this shaking the tree session you did, because my kids being at home and doing schools from home now, they think that shaking the tree is really what it looks like having a job. So now they're working harder to move on and get a job. So that's the first thing. So I've sent them back to the kitchen, and now they're lighting a fire. So now it's time to bring out the Peter Drucker in all of you, because as Mark rightly said, the leaders of tomorrow will be the one asking the right questions. I already received 2-3 of them, but it's time, if you've got some. Again, we won't pretend to be able to answer to all of them this morning, but we'll just pick up some of them in the upcoming minutes. Let me first address the elephant in the room, because that has been asked many times. Yes, you will be able to listen to this webinar a second, third, or fourth time if you wish, by going to our website. So if you go to setym.com/webinar, you can listen to the recording and in this sense have access to the presentation, and you can as well have the link to the article Mark wrote about this presentation. So yes, you can have access to all the material. The first question from somebody from Dominican Republic. How would you separate being a leader from being a superior, Mark?
Being a leader, well, superior is something that appears on the organizational chart, right? It's something somebody has a status, has a job title that makes them higher than you. Sometimes you have to obey your superiors, whatever they say. Leadership, you can be a leader whatever level of the organization you're at. You could be the lowest person, a subordinate, as opposed to a superior, and still play a leadership role by going into a meeting and challenging the status quo, being different, being aware of the social field, really listening to your emotions, listening to what your gut's telling you. And then it depends, how can you deliver those questions? How can you speak to a superior so they can listen to you? Right? Because it's a very interesting social field that's created. If there's 2 people in a room and they are at the same level in an organization, right, they will have a very different conversation, even if one of them gets promoted. Next week, the 2 of them sit down in the same meeting, same 2 people, something's different, right? So, and often superiors can stifle level 3, level 4 conversations. Because it's funny what you mentioned about your children, right? Because the reality is, people say, you know, children are naturally creative, right? They jump, they don't know the rules, so they jump around, they think it's fun, and they're really aware of their bodies. And our education system, and particularly the cultures of our organizations, we go into work and we realize if we dress strange, if we act strange, we will be ostracized, we won't be listened to. And we learn very quickly to have a level 1, we just be quiet. We don't say anything. And if the boss says something, it's much easier, nod your head, go along with it. And the boss will think it's great, it's easy to run, this is an easy team to run, but they are getting so little of your potential, right?
They're not getting the truth, yeah.
Yeah, very different, yeah.
We all need to find back the inner child in us.
Exactly. Yes.
We've got somebody, unfortunately, we don't know from where or who because that's anonymous, but that would like to ask, in your experience, how best can you handle an office politic that is centered on the self-benefits rather than the corporate long-term benefits?
Again, partly is you can't change somebody else, right? That's the challenge. You can encourage people to take training, you can encourage people to watch videos, I guess, like this, but the reality is the best way of influencing other people is to be a role model by going back and adopting this way of being, seeing things differently, contributing differently, and you will get results, right? By doing that. And that's how you start to influence other people. And again, nobody can stop you going back into your office and really listening very consciously to what your emotions are telling you, what your gut's telling you, really being aware of the social feel and trying to manage it. You know, literally the idea of, you know, how do you create the space, the physical space? You know, we do have in many organizations, we do have I mentioned the example of having a meeting in a boardroom. A boardroom is designed to have a very structured, decision-making, rubber stamping, very formal meeting. If you try and have an informal, creative meeting in a boardroom, it won't happen, particularly if people are sitting in suits and sitting in big chairs and sitting at the table and everybody's following the rules. It won't happen. So how do you go back to your organizations and create spaces with whiteboards or whatever it happens to be, and people standing up instead of sitting down, all those kind of things, so you can have the conversations you need to have.
And in terms of these settings, we've got Mr. Raman that is asking a very pertinent question, especially at this time, is how the strategic leadership is changed either positively or negatively by these new way of communicating, webinars, chat, video, intelligent phones, name them. They are all over the places, but how does it have, it has an impact for sure. Would you judge them positively or negatively or neutral or?
If I'd have said 3 months ago, before all this kind of changed our working environment, some of the things I'm doing today, I would have said were not doable online. Actually, a very concrete example, I guess 3 weeks ago, I did a 2-day workshop online. 2-day, 9 to 5, 25 people scattered around Canada. Nobody was together. And if you'd have asked me before whether that was possible, I'd have said no. Whereas once you start to see Zoom or other technologies as an enabler, and how can you exploit it better and use it as we couldn't have, doing polls is a very interesting example and it changes what's happening, and it shapes the conversation. So I think you have to be different. I can't do the same thing sitting here in Montreal that I could do standing in front of a group of people. But that's the challenge of being a leader, right? If you don't want to become a dinosaur, you have to find a way of functioning. And it comes back to that old adage that if you believe it's possible, it's probably possible. If you believe it's not possible, it's not possible. And I've changed over the past 3 months. I think there's a lot of things are possible. I just have to sit down and be very creative how to do it through technology, through Zoom or through any platform, and get the same results. Have in-depth conversations about tough topics with all these people with different points of view through Zoom as opposed to in a room. It's doable. It's just you have to be very different.
Adaptation, exactly, because I don't feel like if you're to send a fax to a millennial that he will understand what you're requiring from him or
Exactly.
Yeah, we'll go on. There's a lot of other questions that are coming in, but unfortunately, again, we will not be able to answer all of them. but maybe we could end up on the comments or the question of Martin Salwa, who asked, would you recommend specific books that they can read by themselves to push the subject further?
Actually, what I could do is I the book business, I guess, is going to be suffering and changing, like every other business. And I think the attention spans of many people reading books has diminished. There's a lot of articles, I think, that are kind of interesting that have come out. I could actually, I'm actually getting ready. It's an interesting example. I'm getting ready to teach a university course completely online over the summer. Right, so I'm just in the process of putting together a reference. I've got 90% complete. I'd be happy to share that through SETYM, and we could maybe send it out as a kind of a leadership. They're articles as opposed to books, but it just means they're easier to read and more concise. Exactly. So we can be more efficient. I'm quite happy to share that.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's very generous of you. As for taking the time this morning to have this discussion with all of us again. We'll have to wrap it this morning now, because it's coming to an end. Just want to point out in completing it that for those of you who enjoyed it, we're going to have webinars like this pretty much every week up till the end of the crisis. So not only on leadership, not only on soft subjects. By next week, if you're interested, again, by going to our website, setym.com/webinar, more than just listening again to this webinar and others, you can register to next week webinar, which will be on procurement. So that's another one that we'll be having by Wednesday of next week on May 13. And if you were interested about the happiness aspect of that Mark discussed using Bhutan as an example, we'll talk about happiness under the angle of HR on May 26th. The title of the webinar will be Happiness at Work. So work 2.0, how changes are being handled, having more millennials joining the workplace. So these are just some examples of webinar that will take place in the upcoming weeks. I just want as well to remind you that you can go through our website, and some of you started posting specific questions in order to get answers from some of our experts. So online technical assistance is now offered to us again to keep in touch with all of you during this time of crisis. So these are our adaptations that we have put in place to try not to stop all activities, because life goes on even with the crisis. So we have to cope with what we're all facing, and that's what we're trying to do with these webinars and technical assistance. So I thank you very much again for joining us.